I was meticulously arranging the silverware when it happened again. Thomas, my father said, his voice unusually flat, we've done this before. I paused a fork halfway to a plate and stared at him. Dad, we've talked about this. It's just a weird feeling. Like a deja vu cranked up to 11. He didn't smile, didn't offer the usual gentle reassurance. No, not just a weird feeling. We've had this exact day before. The rain, the way the light hits the kitchen table, the way you're fussing over the cutlery. He gestured with a hand, almost frantic. It's unsettlingly familiar. I sighed, pushing the silverware aside. Look, Dad, you're getting a little worked up. It's Tuesday. Tuesdays are predictable, and frankly, you've been spending a lot of time lately looking at calendars. Maybe you're just noticing patterns. It's a harmless habit. I tried to inject a note of calm into my voice, but I felt a prickle of unease myself. The rain outside was a steady, persistent drumming, and the light was hitting the table in a remarkably specific way. It's not the calendar, Thomas, he insisted, his gaze fixed on the droplets tracing paths down the window. It's the sequence. The small things. The way the robin landed on the bird feeder this morning. The news report on the radio. It's all been repeated. Exactly. I've seen it. I chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. Dad, you're being ridiculous. You're building a narrative around a few coincidences. You always do this when you're feeling a little out of sorts. I started to clear the table, deliberately avoiding his gaze. Let's just focus on getting ready for Mrs. Henderson's visit. She'll be thrilled with the potato salad. He didn't respond to that, just continued to wash the rain, his brow furrowed. He seemed genuinely disturbed, a flicker of something unsettling in his eyes. I finished clearing the table, stacking the plates neatly in the dishwasher, and then stopped, suddenly aware of the stillness in the kitchen, the oppressive weight of the rain, and my father's unwavering stare. It wasn't just a feeling of unease anymore, it was a creeping sense that something was profoundly wrong. I needed to find out what was driving this, but the thought of confronting him with his increasingly bizarre pronouncements felt unsettlingly familiar too. The rain hadn't let up. It was still a steady, insistent drumming on the window panes, and the gray light seemed to leach all color from the world. I started making coffee, trying to inject some normalcy into the situation, but the movements felt sluggish, deliberate, like I was wading through thick water. As the coffee brewed, I caught my father's eye again. He was still watching the rain, his face a mask of concentration, and there was a tightness around his mouth that wasn't there before. He didn't acknowledge the coffee, didn't even seem to register its aroma. Then it happened. Just as I poured the dark liquid into my mug, the news report came on. The exact same report. The anchor, a man with a perpetually weary expression, was detailing a minor traffic accident on Elm Street. A silver sedan had spun out of control after hitting a pothole. The specifics were identical to the one I'd heard yesterday, down to the color of the car and the terse statement from the police officer. I nearly choked on my coffee. I set the mug down with a thud, and my father's head snapped around, his gaze locking onto mine. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice low and strained. It's happening again. I tried to offer a rational explanation, a mumbled something about probability, about how small events could sometimes repeat themselves. But the words felt hollow even to my own ears. Then, while I was clearing the dishes, I noticed it, a smear of coffee on the countertop, mirroring the stain on my mug from yesterday. It was a clumsy accident, a careless spill, but the way the dark liquid spread, the exact shape of the mess, it was unnervingly familiar. Later, walking down the street, I saw a child, a boy, maybe 7 or 8, trip on the same cobblestone. The same cobblestone. It was a small thing, a child's misfortune, but the way he fell, the frantic scramble for his shoes, the brief, surprised expression on his face, it was a perfect echo of an incident I'd witnessed earlier that morning, a woman nearly stumbling over the same stone while rushing to catch a bus. The rain continued its relentless rhythm, and with each repetition, the feeling intensified. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. It was a meticulously constructed pattern, a suffocating loop of events. I told myself it was a strange, awful trick of the mind, a psychological anomaly. But the sheer volume of these repetitions, the impossible precision of their recurrence, was starting to unravel my skepticism. I felt a desperate need to document everything, to capture these echoes before they consumed me completely. I started with a small, battered notebook and a cheap digital recorder. It wasn't a grand plan, just a frantic attempt to impose order on what felt increasingly like chaos. I began by meticulously recording the weather. Not just rain, the precise shade of gray, the velocity of the drops, the way the wind shifted just before a particularly heavy burst. At times, the intervals between raindrops, noting the subtle variations. It was tedious, utterly pointless, but the act of recording, of observing and quantifying, provided a sliver of control. The conversations were harder. I started subtly angling the recorder towards my father's discussions with Mr. Henderson, the neighbor, about the upcoming garden club meeting. Henderson repeated his complaints about the slugs almost verbatim, just as he had the day before and the day before that. I made a note, Henderson slug complaints. Repetition, 3. It felt absurd, like I was collecting evidence for a crime I didn't understand. I spent the afternoon documenting the movements of the robin on the feeder. It was a small thing, really, but the insistent, almost mechanical repetition of its head tilts, its brief flights to snag a sunflower seed, the exact angle of its perch against the oak tree, it was unnerving. I estimated its movements, recorded the duration of each beating session. I felt a growing pressure to find a pattern, a key, anything that could explain this mimicry. Later, while I was attempting to sketch the coffee stain spreading across the kitchen table, a perfect mirror image of the one I'd made the previous morning, I noticed the little boy from across the street playing in his yard. He tripped, just as he had yesterday, on the same uneven cobblestone near the curb. It wasn't a dramatic fall, just a clumsy stumble, but the timing, the placement of his feet, the way he instinctively reached out to steady himself, it was chillingly precise. I recorded the entire event. Child cobblestone fall repetition, too. My father watched me, a strange, almost melancholic expression on his face. "You're taking notes, Thomas," he said, his voice low. "You're trying to understand." "Trying to find a pattern, Dad," I replied, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "Trying to make sense of things." He didn't respond directly, but he moved closer, his gaze fixed on the rain hammering against the windows. The relentless rhythm seemed to amplify the feeling that I was trapped within something vast and unknowable, something designed to wear me down, to break me. I continued to write, desperate to hold on to the illusion of control, to document the echoes before they swallowed me whole. The rain hadn't lessened, though the intensity had shifted. Instead of a violent deluge, it was now a steady, insistent drumming, each drop a tiny, insistent hammer blow against the glass. I was struggling to keep the recorder running, the white noise of the storm threatening to drown out the meticulous observations I was trying to capture. My hand trembled slightly as I scribbled, attempting to categorize the shift in rainfall, a subtle darkening of the gray, a slight decrease in the droplet size. It felt utterly pointless, a futile exercise in quantifying the inevitable. "There's something I need to show you," Arthur said, his voice low, almost hesitant. He'd been silent for a long moment, simply observing the rain, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He didn't offer an explanation, just a quiet invitation. He led me down the creaking stairs to the basement, a space I'd always considered drab and unremarkable, filled with dusty furniture and forgotten tools. But tonight, illuminated by the flickering bulb he'd switched on, it felt different, charged with a strange, unsettling energy. He stopped before a section of the wall, pushing aside a heavy antique wardrobe. Behind it lay a doorway, concealed for decades perhaps. The room itself was small, cluttered with a bizarre collection of objects. There were intricate diagrams sketched on large sheets of parchment, detailing what appeared to be complex wave patterns and temporal distortions. Handwritten notes filled with equations and terminology I didn't understand covered every available surface. A tangle of wires connected to a series of strange electronic devices, oscillators, amplifiers, and a device that resembled a modified oscilloscope, all emitting a faint pulsing hum. It smelled faintly of ozone and something metallic, like old machinery. "I've been investigating," he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "I've been trying to understand the anomalies, the repetitions, the shifts." His voice lacked conviction, almost apologetic. He avoided my gaze, focusing on adjusting a dial on one of the devices. "It's difficult to explain." I started with the physics, the mathematics of time, the way it's perceived, the way memory works. It became obsessive. He pulled out a smaller notebook, its pages filled with cramped, frantic handwriting. I discovered that the brain doesn't simply record events, it reconstructs them, constantly replaying them, layering them with emotion and interpretation. And there are ways to influence that process. He paused, looking up at me, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I believe someone was actively manipulating things, directing these repetitions." He didn't elaborate, but the implication hung heavy in the air. He wasn't simply observing, he was participating. The relentless drumming of the rain seemed to grow louder, pressing in on me, a physical manifestation of the unsettling truth I was beginning to grasp. The notebook slipped from my grasp, thudding softly onto the concrete floor of the basement. I knelt to retrieve it, a growing sense of dread solidifying in my stomach. Arthur was right. He wasn't simply observing, he was participating. The frantic script filled the pages, a desperate scrawl detailing equations I didn't understand, diagrams of oscillating waveforms, and increasingly unsettling phrases like temporal resonance and cognitive anchoring. Then, I found it, a small folded sheet tucked deep within the notebook's spine. It was a printed report, brittle with age, bearing the insignia of a stylized hourglass. Beneath it, in bold lettering, was the name Kronos. I flipped through the document, a cold certainty settling over me. Kronos wasn't a research institute, it was an organization. The report detailed Project Echo, outlining a series of experiments involving precise temporal observation and the manipulation of subjective timelines. The language was clinical, detached, almost coldly scientific, yet the implications were terrifyingly clear. The repetition wasn't a random phenomenon, it was being deliberately orchestrated. The report mentioned a specific facility, located in a remote region of upstate New York, Black Ridge, and detailed a protocol for participant recruitment, highlighting the importance of minimizing external stimuli and optimizing memory recall. I scanned the document further, noticing a series of dates and locations related to the experiments, all converging around the time Arthur had begun experiencing the repetitions. There were references to neurological mapping, advanced EEG technology, and a disturbing focus on the subconscious, specifically, the reconstruction of memories. It was like a jigsaw puzzle, and suddenly the pieces were starting to click into place. This wasn't just Arthur's obsession, it was something larger, something meticulously planned. He began to speak again, his voice a low murmur, barely audible above the escalating rain. They were interested in the neurological pathways associated with déjà vu, with the way the brain reconstructs experience. They believed, and I, in my arrogance, began to believe, that we could control it, that we could tune the memory. He gestured vaguely at the array of equipment in the room, the wave diagrams, the tangle of wires leading to the electronic devices, the dozens of notebooks filled with his observations. I started tracking the patterns, attempting to identify the triggers, the variables that seemed to exacerbate the effect. He picked up a small silver device, a handheld spectroscope, and turned it over in his hands. I thought I was a scientist, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. I was trying to understand the nature of time itself, of memory, of existence. He paused, his gaze distant, lost in some internal struggle. I was so focused on the mechanics, on the data, that I failed to see the bigger picture. I became a tool, a node in their experiment. The rain continued its relentless assault against the basement walls, and I felt a chilling realization. Arthur hadn't just been unwittingly involved, he'd been deliberately drawn into something profoundly unsettling. The rain hadn't let up, a mournful drumming that seemed to echo the turmoil in my own head. I needed to understand. I started sifting through the chaos of Arthur's workbench, a landscape of disassembled electronics and scattered notes, when I found it. A small external hard drive almost completely obscured beneath a tangle of wires. It was unlabeled, unassuming, and I hesitated before plugging it into the laptop. A sense of dread, cold and insistent, warned me against it, but curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for answers, propelled me forward. The drive booted with a series of diagnostic screens, finally settling on a folder titled simply Project Echo Echo Documentation. Inside were dozens of documents, research reports, recruitment flyers, participant logs, and, chillingly, video recordings. The first video showed a brightly lit room, sterile and impersonal, filled with people, young mostly, some older, sitting in identical chairs, wearing what looked like modified EEG headsets. The quality was grainy, the lighting poor, but the faces were familiar. They were the people Arthur had described as volunteers. The reports detailed the organization's goal to map and understand recurring memories. Chronos, as they called themselves, believed that the key to unlocking human consciousness lay in identifying and cataloging these repetitions, those moments that felt strangely familiar, yet couldn't be fully recalled. The recruitment material was slick, promising groundbreaking advancements in cognitive science and a unique opportunity to contribute to our understanding of the human mind. They emphasized minimizing external stimuli, creating an environment conducive to optimal memory recall, and meticulously documenting every sensation experienced by the participant. There was a disturbing focus on precision, on quantifying every twitch, every flicker of the eye. As I scrolled through the participant logs, I found Arthur's name repeatedly listed, Subject 47. His entry detailed his involvement in a series of sessions, ostensibly focused on memory reconstruction. He described the procedures, the EEG readings, the targeted auditory prompts, the carefully calibrated visual displays, all aimed at strengthening or altering specific memories. The reports consistently noted a significant increase in reported episodic recall and a demonstrable shift in subjective temporal perception. Then, I found a transcript of a meeting between Chronos researchers and Arthur. The audio was clear, revealing a conversation about optimizing the cognitive anchoring, the process of reinforcing a particular memory through repeated exposure. The researchers were discussing the use of subtle auditory cues delivered via the headset to trigger the desired sequence of events. It was a cold, calculated discussion devoid of any ethical considerations. A wave of nausea washed over me. Arthur hadn't just been unwittingly involved, he'd been deliberately manipulated, groomed, a pawn in a sophisticated and utterly terrifying experiment. The silver device he'd held, the spectroscope, wasn't a tool for understanding time. It was a component of a system designed to distort it, to fracture the very fabric of someone's lived experience. I closed the laptop, the images burned into my mind. The rain continued to fall, and the basement felt less like a laboratory and more like a tomb. The rain hammered against the concrete foundation of the basement, a relentless, drumming rhythm that seemed to sync with the throb behind my eyes. I needed to clear my head, to push back against the suffocating realization of what my father had become. I started methodically, pulling out the remaining data chips from the laptop, organizing them into a semblance of order. It was then I noticed the diagrams, intricate schematics of the headset, not just a simple recording device, but a meticulously crafted instrument of neurological manipulation. Lines crisscrossed, labeled with terms like temporal resonance calibration and cognitive synchronization matrix. I dug deeper into the participant logs, focusing on Subject 47's sessions. The entries weren't just describing auditory prompts and visual displays. They detailed precise timings, frequencies, and even the subtle shifts in color saturation. It wasn't simply about memory recall, it was about creating a pattern, a loop. One entry, dated precisely 7 days before the last, described a specific sequence of binaural beats, a low hum paired with pulsing red and blue light, designed to establish a stable temporal reference point. Another detailed adjustments to the intensity of the auditory cues based on Arthur's brainwave activity as measured by the EEG. The researchers, the Chronos team, weren't just observing, they were actively sculpting his perception of time. Then I found it a recurring phrase, repeated almost obsessively in several logs, reinforcing the cycle. It was accompanied by a graph charting Arthur's subjective temporal experience, marked with a steadily rising curve labeled Repetitive Resonance Index. The goal, it seemed, wasn't to access a memory, but to amplify a feeling, a sensation of déjà vu, of reliving the same moments again and again. The spectroscope, I realized, wasn't just recording the data, it was actively feeding it back into the system, using precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulses to stimulate specific neural pathways. I traced the wiring from the headset back to a central control unit, a small, unassuming device that looked like an advanced amplifier. Connected to it were a series of miniature speakers, each emitting the precisely timed auditory cues. I picked up a discarded earphone, examining it closely. It wasn't just transmitting sound, it was delivering a targeted barrage of neurological signals, subtly altering Arthur's perception of reality. The nausea returned, sharper this time, laced with a profound sense of dread. It wasn't just manipulation, it was a meticulously engineered prison, built within his own mind, where time wasn't linear, but a self-repeating echo. The cold, metallic tang of the basement seemed to intensify, a scent of calculated control and unsettling repetition. The nausea intensified, a tightening coil in my stomach that threatened to unravel me entirely. I forced myself to focus on the amplifier, on the tiny speakers radiating the precisely timed pulses. That's when I noticed it, a subtle shimmer around the device, a heat haze that wasn't generated by the electronics. It was visual noise, like looking at a badly tuned television. I reached out almost instinctively and touched the amplifier's casing. The shimmer intensified, and for a split second the room seemed to blur, not in a visual distortion, but in a disorientation of time itself. It was as if the air thickened, resisting movement, and the sounds of the outside, the distant rumble of traffic, the chirping of birds, faded into a muted drone. I snatched my hand away, heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to understand what I was seeing, what this device was doing. I started systematically examining the amplifier's control panel, a bewildering array of dials and switches, each labeled with cryptic symbols. Then I found it a small shielded screen displaying a complex graph. It wasn't displaying audio levels or signal strength. It was charting brainwave activity, specifically Arthur's. The peaks and troughs weren't random. They were rigidly, unnervingly consistent, mirroring the cyclical patterns of the auditory cues emanating from the speakers. But that wasn't the disturbing part. Overlaying the brainwave data was a second graph, a pulsating line representing the repetitive resonance index. It wasn't just rising, it was accelerating, climbing exponentially. I realized with a sickening jolt that the device wasn't merely recording or amplifying memories, it was actively reinforcing them, using the auditory prompts and the EEG feedback to create a self-sustaining loop. The amplifier wasn't just amplifying the signal, it was feeding it back into Arthur's brain, creating a positive feedback loop that was solidifying the temporal distortions. It was like a record skipping repeatedly on a single groove, the needle digging deeper with each rotation. The logs, the obsessive talk of rewind forcing the cycle, suddenly made horrifying sense. This wasn't about mapping memories, it was about trapping them, building a temporal prison around Arthur's consciousness. A new log lay open on a nearby workbench, its pages filled with frantic, almost illegible handwriting. The day was a week prior, resonance levels critical. Subject 47 exhibiting increased resistance. Introducing Phase 3, Temporal Locking Protocol. The following entries detailed a desperate attempt to induce a state of temporal lock, a sustained, stabilized loop, by precisely targeting Arthur's brainwave patterns and correlating them with environmental data. The team was attempting to force his consciousness into a predictable repeating state, a temporal echo chamber. The spectroscope readings were increasing in frequency, mirroring the escalating chaos. The central control unit emitted calibrated auditory cues, not just to influence his perception, but to actively sculpt his experience, forcing him into this unending repetition. The cold, metallic tang intensified, now overlaid with the subtle, sickly sweet scent of antiseptic, the smell of control, and of profound, inescapable stagnation. The log was slick with something that wasn't ink. I wiped a section with the edge of my shirt, revealing a darker, viscous stain that smelled faintly of iron. The handwriting was a mess, a frantic scrawl that mirrored the spectroscope's erratic display. It wasn't just that the readings were increasing, they were becoming organized. Before, the jumps were random, a chaotic surge of neural activity. Now the spikes aligned, creating a jagged, almost rhythmic pattern. Beneath the stream of rushed notes, I found a series of diagrams, meticulously drawn schematics of the temporal resonance calibration device. I hadn't realized the extent of its complexity. It wasn't just an amplifier, it was a symphony of control, a network of sensors and actuators designed to precisely manipulate the very fabric of his brainwaves. One entry stood out, dated 6 days prior. It was signed by Dr. Moreau, the project lead, a name I hadn't encountered in previous logs. Loop stabilization achieving 78% efficiency, temporal lock parameters nearing convergence. Implementing Phase 2, environmental synchronization correlating auditory feedback with fluctuating atmospheric pressure readings. The implication was terrifying. They weren't just trying to hold him in a repeat, they were actively shaping the environment around him to fit the loop. I checked the calibration records for the environmental sensors. They were constantly adjusting, fine tuning the airflow in the chamber, modulating the humidity, even subtly shifting the temperature, all tied directly to Arthur's brainwave activity. I moved to the control console, a bewildering array of switches and dials. A secondary monitor displayed a graph of Arthur's EEG readings, overlaid with the fluctuating atmospheric pressure data. It was like watching a puppeteer pulling strings, except the puppet was my father, and the strings were his own mind. A chilling realization dawned on me. The repetitive resonance index wasn't a byproduct of his distress, it was the purpose of the experiment. They weren't just observing a natural phenomenon, they were deliberately constructing it. I scrolled further down the log, searching for any hint of explanation. Then I found it, buried beneath a dense paragraph of technical jargon, confirmation of artificial temporal resonance. Subject 47's cognitive architecture exhibits a heightened susceptibility to cyclical stimuli. The initial anomaly was not spontaneous, but a carefully cultivated resonance pattern, designed to isolate and amplify specific memory clusters. The objective is now to actively manipulate the loop, refining the temporal parameters to achieve a stable, demonstrable effect. The words hammered against me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a struggle against a random force. Arthur wasn't trapped. He was a subject, a pawn in a twisted game of temporal engineering. The cold metallic tang intensified, now laced with the faintest echo of the antiseptic. But beneath it, I detected something new. A subtle, high-pitched whine emanating from the core of the temporal resonance calibration device. A sound almost too high frequency to register. I slammed the datapad down on the workbench, the sudden movement jarring against the stillness of the room. The whine, that almost unbearable frequency, seemed to burrow into my skull, amplifying the panic already clawing at my throat. I reread the entry, the words now burned into my memory with an almost painful clarity. Actively manipulate the loop. It wasn't just observation, it was active intervention. The Kronos team hadn't discovered a naturally occurring phenomenon, they had created it. They weren't studying the effects of repetition. They were deliberately constructing a temporal echo chamber, refining it, controlling it. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave, washing away any lingering doubts, any half-formed theories about a simple malfunction or a subconscious obsession. This wasn't about understanding memory, it was about engineering it. I pushed myself away from the console, pacing the small, sterile lab, my boots clicking against the polished concrete floor. The air hung heavy with the scent of ozone and something else, something subtly metallic that I couldn't quite place. I needed to understand the scope of this manipulation, the precision with which they were operating. I returned to the device itself, examining the intricate web of wires and sensors that comprised the temporal resonance calibration. The schematics, previously a confusing jumble of technical diagrams, now seemed to pulse with a sinister intent. I focused on the EEG sensors, noting their precise placement, the way they were wired to the amplifier's core. It wasn't just about identifying memory clusters, it was about targeting them, about deliberately feeding specific stimuli to trigger and sustain the loop. Then I noticed something I'd missed before, a small recessed panel on the amplifier's base, almost hidden beneath a tangle of cabling. I carefully pried it open, revealing a small data port. Hesitantly, I plugged in the datapad, expecting a torrent of technical information. Instead, a single file appeared, a text document, heavily encrypted. My fingers flew across the keyboard, rapidly cycling through decryption algorithms. It took nearly 15 minutes, the whine of the amplifier a constant, irritating drone in my ears, before the document finally yielded. The first line read, Project Echo Phase 4 Initialization. Beneath it, a cascade of numbers and letters, a complex series of codes. I recognized the format immediately, a sophisticated temporal coordinate lock, far more precise than anything I'd encountered before. Scrolling further, I unearthed a detailed geological survey map of the surrounding region, overlaid with a series of spectral readings. It was then I saw it, a specific location, marked with a bright red cross, pinpointing a fault line several miles to the north. And beneath the coordinates, a chilling timestamp, event trigger, 7012:47. The next line was even more terrifying. Estimated seismic event, 72 hours. The cold metallic tang intensified, now laced with the faint growing certainty that my father wasn't simply caught in a bizarre experiment. He was trapped in a countdown. The timestamp 07-2012-47 hammered at me with the force of a physical blow. 72 hours. That wasn't just a prediction, it was a deadline. I zoomed in on the geological survey, tracing the red cross with my finger. It centered on a narrow valley known locally as Serpent's Gulch, a place my father had always dismissed as unremarkable. A scenic detour on his infrequent drives. Now it was a potential epicenter, a point of convergence for some catastrophic artificially induced event. The spectral readings accompanying the map were even more unsettling. They weren't just showing geological fault lines, they were highlighting areas of heightened electromagnetic activity, pulsing with the same energy signature as the temporal resonance calibration device. It was as if the amplifier itself was actively seeking out, amplifying, and directing the seismic energy. I downloaded the entire file, meticulously backing it up onto several external drives, a frantic attempt to preserve what I was uncovering. The sheer complexity of the code was staggering, not just a simple coordinate lock, but a sophisticated algorithmic sequence designed to anticipate, predict, and potentially catalyze the seismic event. There were layers within layers of encryption, each one more baffling than the last. I realized this wasn't just about observing a natural phenomenon, it was about manipulating it, controlling the timing and intensity of the earthquake. A sudden, insistent buzzing filled the room. The amplifier had shifted its output, increasing the electromagnetic pulse frequency. It was a clear indication that someone or something was actively monitoring my progress. I glanced nervously at the security cameras, the faces of the technicians blurred in the periphery. Had they noticed me accessing the data port? I quickly initiated a diagnostic scan of the amplifier, searching for any anomalies, any trace of external interference. The results were alarming. The device wasn't just calibrating, it was actively receiving and transmitting data, a continuous stream of information directed at the amplifier's core. Then it hit me. The temporal coordinate lock wasn't just targeting a location, it was targeting a time. 07-12-47 wasn't just the predicted start of the earthquake. It was the moment the amplifier intended to trigger it. The fault line wasn't just a passive participant, it was the instrument of destruction. I scrolled back through the documents, searching for any further clues, any explanation for this horrifying realization. And then I found it, buried deep within a series of calculated probabilities. Temporal synchronization requirement, subject A, Arthur primary resonance node. It was a chilling confirmation. My father wasn't a subject, he was a key. He was the anchor, the linchpin in this terrifying, meticulously orchestrated plan. The blood drained from my face, leaving me feeling cold and strangely detached. It wasn't just that my father was a key, it was that he was trapped. The document Moreau's meticulous calculations suddenly shifted in focus. It wasn't about triggering an earthquake, it was about maintaining a loop. I scrolled further, the words blurring through a film of disbelief and a rising panic. Then I found it a schematic, chaotic tangle of neural pathways overlaid with the temporal resonance calibration device's output. It labeled the process chronal imprinting. I focused on Arthur's brainwave patterns recorded during the last 72 hours, comparing them to the device's calibration. The data revealed a terrifyingly precise mirroring, a rhythmic pulsing that wasn't just reflecting the device's output, but responding to it. He wasn't passively receiving the temporal manipulation, he was actively participating in it. I felt a nausea rising, a physical manifestation of the horror unfolding. It took a moment, a sickening clarity to understand. He wasn't just a node, he was a prisoner within the loop. I rushed to the observation room, the sterile white walls suddenly oppressive. Arthur was asleep in his chair, his face relaxed, almost peaceful. But the monitors around him screamed with activity, the complex waveforms a testament to the relentless calibration. I watched him, a detached observer, and realized that his movements, his breaths, were part of the algorithm. Every blink, every shift in his posture, was fed back into the system, reinforcing the cycle. He was caught in a 24-hour loop, a terrifyingly precise echo of himself, unknowingly repeating the same actions, over and over. I checked the logs again, searching for any indication of how this had been initiated, how this insidious trap had been laid. There it was, buried within a subroutine labeled Temporal Stability Protocol. It detailed the gradual amplification of the resonance index, coupled with adjustments to Arthur's circadian rhythm, designed to solidify the loop. The goal wasn't just to induce repetition, it was to make it permanent. The timestamp of 7-12-47 wasn't just a trigger, it was a self-sustaining feedback loop, built around Arthur's very being. The seismic event wasn't the intended outcome, it was the result of the prolonged, carefully orchestrated temporal distortion. I felt a desperate need to disconnect him, to break the chain, but the data suggested that any attempt to interfere would only exacerbate the problem, further entangling him within the loop. The thought of him trapped in this endless repetition, a puppet dancing to Moreau's algorithm, was unbearable. I needed to understand how long this had been going on, how far they'd progressed before I could even consider a solution. The shift was subtle at first, a tightening in my chest, a prickling on my skin. I'd been meticulously